Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm just adding a short note to the top of this video to let you know that moving forward, I'm going to be recording longer audio introductions and sort of expansions to each of the episodes, but only on the audio versions of the podcast. My thinking was that I wanted to create the episodes as kind of self-contained introductions to the ideas that you'll hear in each of them. And it occurred to me that some of you would be very familiar with the ideas that we're talking about. And for some of you, they'll be brand new. So, what I want to do in the conversations themselves is just have that conversation with the guest and kind of go in, assuming that you have some knowledge about what we're talking about. But then in the introduction, I kind of want to unpack some of the ideas, the background, the concepts, maybe just back up a little bit and give a little bit more of a preface to the conversation so that if it is new to you, you can jump in and kind of be ready and have some sense for what we're talking about. Now, I'm not going to do that on YouTube. I tried to record some longer introductions here for the video channel, and it just didn't feel like it worked. There's something about this kind of one-way directional video camera mode that it didn't feel like it translated. It felt like it worked in the audio, but not here. So I'm going to keep just the conversations on YouTube, and I'll give short little introductions about who the speaker is, where you can find them, and so on. But those longer introductions will show up on the audio version of the podcast, so you can get those episodes on Apple and Spotify and Google and wherever else you're listening to those episodes. So just wanted to say that at the top of the show here. I recorded the first of those introductions for this episode. My guest is Andrew McLuhan, who many of you will recognize as the son of Eric McLuhan and the grandson of Marshall McLuhan. So I was really excited to talk to him. He founded an institute called the McLuhan Institute in 2017. And it's a really cool place. It's a library and a teaching center and a home to many of the McLuhans' books, papers, annotations, artifacts, outlines for talks, notes, memorabilia, all kinds of stuff like that that Andrew is collecting and preserving and making an inventory of, and then making them available to the rest of us. So many of you will be excited to hear from him, and I encourage you to check out the links in the show notes to this episode. I'm linking to Andrew's page, to the McLuhan Institute's Patreon. If you find any value in what Andrew is doing, I highly encourage you to check out the Patreon, consider supporting it. The Institute is already built, it already exists, so Andrew's already doing his thing. But as with so many of these projects, they really are a labor of love. So be sure to check out the notes there. And before we get into the show, I also want to mention that just incidentally, Andrew just published a book called Written Matter. It's out now with Revelor Press, and it actually just launched, I think, on the 23rd, so just a day or two ago. And yeah, I'll post a link to that in the notes as well. Totally coincidental timing with this episode, but it really worked out. Anyway, be sure to check out the audio episode if you want to get more of that, like I said, background information on the topics that we're discussing on each show. I'm going to expand on those and also think about kind of building out more resources for everybody, so that the podcast can be good for shop talk, people who are already involved in these conversations, but also can kind of create a kind of a learning environment, or maybe a little bit of an on-ramp for folks for whom, like I said, the concepts are new, or the figures are new, or you're not steeped in the larger conversation. So I really want to get people into that through those introductions. So I'm going to continue working on those, and I may also expand those introductions out into, other resources, links, maybe small essays, things like that, so that you can have those as well. Anyway, that's the note for today. And now I'd like you to welcome Andrew McLuhan. So I thought maybe we should start off right away by talking about the McLuhan Institute and the work that you're doing there. Can you just give us a little intro on what is the McLuhan Institute? Why was it founded? And what are you hoping to do with it?
I'd be happy to. Uh, well, that's a big question. It's a very large question. As you said, I started getting more involved in the family business uh, in almost 2010. So just over 10 years ago now, and started getting more and more involved. And it was in 2017 that my father always had a little bit fragile health, and I kind of looked around and realized that he wasn't going to be here forever. And there was nothing in place to keep going when he passed away, and that freaked me out a little bit. So I decided to start this thing called the McLuhan Institute because the thing is, my father kept going, doing what he learned from his father, and I'd done my best to pick up on that tradition. And it's a particular approach, and can even be considered a tradition of its own, I think. And there's nowhere in the world that really teaches this tradition or follows it except, and this is my opinion, obviously, what my father had been doing. So it scared me to imagine that my father would pass away and there would be nothing in place to carry on this tradition of McLuhan studies. So I realized nobody was going to do it if I didn't. So basically, I dreamed up this idea for the McLuhan Institute to be kind of an umbrella for all these different activities. Work with our archives and collections, which started for me with documenting and inventorying Marshall's library. Now here I am in Eric McLuhan's library, which is very similar, and I'm kind of doing the same thing. So archival work, preservation, taking things forward. So my father did a lot of work in picking up projects that Marshall left unfinished, beginning with Laws of Media, the New Science that they co-wrote and co-discovered, but also continuing on with projects like Media and Formal Cause, bringing together a collection, a definitive collection of the McLuhan approach to this idea of formal causality. Theories of Communication, which came out from Peter Lang in 2011, which is another thing Marshall left undone, and various other things. And my father was a true scholar, which I am not. I'm an interested amateur. In our earlier communication, Adam, you talked about, you phrased in terms of an apprenticeship, which is
Mhm.
very apt, and maybe we'll get into that. But so I saw my role as kind of being able to take things forward, and maybe have a unique opportunity to bring things to the world in a new way since I work outside of academia.
Mhm.
Um, Access is one of the main reasons why I wanted to start the McLuhan Institute, because I believe we're in a time and a place where, more than ever, we need access to tools for apprehending, understanding the effects of technologies on people and cultures. And McLuhan has a lot of those to offer. So, what I try to do is understand these things for myself, and then bring them to today, hopefully in understandable terms, for today and tomorrow. So that's
Mhm.
basically where the McLuhan Institute comes from. As it happens, I started it in the summer of 2017, and less than a year later, my father died. So, which was rather unexpected, but I was glad I had at least put in that much planning and work toward um, this.
Mhm. Mhm. Was your father able to visit the physical location before he passed?
Well, this is his actual, property.
Oh,
My
okay.
wife and I yeah, my wife and I, so this is Eric McLuhan's library,
Hmm.
which is, actually, it's kind of funny. I realized in the last year that it's very similar in size and nature to the Center for Culture and Technology in Toronto, which Marshall started in '63. And he was granted the use of a coach house, a small building tucked away behind the Medieval Institute. And it's funny, but this building is actually very similar to that building in size and kind of in spirit as well. So yeah, my father had continued his work in this two-story building, which is library and archive. And after he passed, my mom decided that the property was too much for her, and so she made plans to move. Of course, then the pandemic happened, but my mom bought a new place nearby. This is in the countryside in southern Ontario.
Hmm.
My mom moved into town to a new house, and my wife and I, God bless her, she supported my idea of selling our house and trying to buy this place. Because the thing is, I wouldn't be able to move 6,000 books and associated archives and ephemera and stuff into our house. It just wouldn't happen. So instead, we listed our house, and somehow it sold, and it was enough to buy this place. So hopefully, this will be the home of McLuhan studies for decades, if not generations, to
Hmm.
come. So in answer to your question, my father worked for the last 15 years of his life in this building. His desk is just over there, and I'm
Wow.
sitting at my desk in this little corner of the office.
Hmm.
So the building really is kind of infused with his explorations and residual energies. It's a very special place.
Right. Yeah, that is special. Obviously, right now, people's ability to travel and move around is a little bit uh, modified, to say the least, because of the pandemic. But is this you call it an institute? Do you envision sort of in person lectures and events there, or is it more kind of the kind of a reservoir of these artifacts and the library and so on? Or do people come there? Is it a kind of place that you could go to and take classes at and things like that?
Yeah, I'm very eager to be able to open the doors and let people come in and explore because there's there's a lot to be said about physical presence and materiality. It's interesting where I live in Prince Edward County. It's on the north shore of Lake Ontario, and to the west you have Toronto, which is where the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library is, and that holds Marshall McLuhan's library,
Mhm.
which was named a few years ago to the UNESCO Memory of the World. And then to the east you have Ottawa, our nation's capital, which has the National Archives and holds Marshall McLuhan's papers, his manuscripts and letters and things like that. And with myself, I'm kind of located almost equidistant between the two places. So it forms a natural kind of stop in between the two places. One of my plans for the Institute here is upstairs to build a suite, kind of an intellectual Airbnb for researchers and artists and anybody interested to come and spend a night or a couple nights and be able to be in the library. I have an extra desk over here that will be available for people to come and because there, not to get too weird about it, but there really is a heavy vibe in here,
Mhm.
and when you're in and mingling among the texts and things that are lying around, it really does add something to the nature of your work. So I'm very much looking forward to be able to invite not only researchers and scholars, but also the interested tourist,
Mhm.
because this area in which I live, Prince Edward County, is kind of an up and coming spot in Ontario. The Drake Hotel, which is a cool kind of hip place in Toronto, has an outpost here. It's become a wine region in the last couple decades. There's a lot of reasons for people to visit here for food and wine, but outside of that, not so much. So I'm hoping to add this as a destination for people to
Mm.
feed their intellect and their
Mhm.
intellectual curiosity
Mhm.
in between sipping and munching.
I'm fascinated by sort of your educational development, which you've mentioned hasn't followed a sort of traditional scholarly route in the sense of degrees and certificates and institutes and stuff like that. But that, to me, that doesn't at all mean that there isn't like pedagogy and development and, like I was saying, it sounded like an apprenticeship, your grandfather, then your father, now you. This is the family business. But instead of shoemaking, it's a certain kind of um, intellectual relation, or in a sense a learned way of perceiving the world and relating to it, that I think can certainly be taught effectively outside of sort of traditional channels. But I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about how that actually worked for you, how it unfolded in your life, and how you got to be sort of the curator of the sort of the family business, but also, a thinker within that lineage?
I'd be happy to. It all happened very organically, which is to say, not so much intentionally on my part, but it's a matter of being in a certain place in a certain time for things to align, I suppose. On this property, there's this two-story barn, and then next door there's a three-story barn. Your iconic three-story big red barn. And in the basement of that barn, I have a workshop. So for the last decade or so, I've run a small business doing furniture upholstery. I take people's antique and vintage chairs, I tear them apart, and I fix them up and I put them back together. So it's an interesting juxtaposition between uh, a kind of hands-on workshop and a different kind of hands-on workshop. And my work in the one informs my work in the other. It was a really great thing to be working here with my father because, I'd be working next door on a piece of furniture, and I'd come over and have lunch with my dad or whatever, and be talking to him about things. And then I'd go back next door and, work them out in my mind as my hands are busy doing other things. And I found that method very helpful for me. I don't consider, not to be falsely modest or anything, but I don't consider myself to be brilliant or, gifted above average with intelligence. I've put a lot of work into the understanding I've come by. And I really believe that if I can get it, then anybody can, really,
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
some effort. And so it was a great little setup where, because these McLuhan ideas are a lot. A little goes a long way. Read understanding. You can't read understanding media cover to cover, but you really have to take it a page, a paragraph, a sentence at a time. So it's great to have another job where I can dip in and read that paragraph, and then I can work while I work. Sort of work it out while you work.
Hmm.
So that's been a great thing. And then I could come back over and ask for clarification, and my dad would talk to me some more and then send me on my way again. And that's basically how we carried on. In between, I mentioned my dad's kind of fragile health, so I started becoming his travel companion. He was diabetic and sometimes would have a low blood sugar thing, and it was important to have somebody around who knew what to do. So that was me, and I got him out of a couple of tight scrapes, except for the last one. And that was really the best because basically we would leave here and head to the airport, and all the way there and all the time back until we got home, it was just like one long um, class, really. And I loved it. I mean, uh, at first, much of these things went over my head, but you know, uh, knowledge and understanding builds. It's I'm going to relate everything to manual labor and everything because that's what I know. But when you're constructing a house, it's the same as when you're building your thought. You lay a foundation, and things build, and the foundation supports the later additions, and so you make progress. I feel, and that's really how it went. So when I started the McLuhan Institute, I really brought that same kind of method to the McLuhan Institute, and that's a focus on practicality.
Hmm.
Um, because I'm interested in less in theory, which actually this is very McLuhan, but I'm interested less in theory in than in what than in tools, than in what we can do with theories, you know.
Hmm.
And Marshall was the same way. He was as he'd say, perfectly willing to scrap any of his ideas when they outlived their usefulness. And he did this quite a few times with things like hot and cool media. So that's the one work informed the other, and that's how I got here today,
Hmm.
by the less conventional route. I mean, my own studies, I've spent more time teaching university classes than I've spent inside them on the student side. So, that's kind of funny to me.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. What does that relationship look like then for you between the McLuhan Institute, your in-depth knowledge of your family's work, and the broader sort of media studies field? I'm curious about probing you a little deeper on at the top of the show. You said that you didn't feel like there was a place for this work to kind of land after your father passed. And, I'm sure myself, people listening, people who are aware of these conversations are thinking like, oh, well, but there's a tradition there. People are getting doctorates, using McLuhan's work, and there are media studies programs. There's a media ecology association that's very tied to this conversation. Publications, journals, things like that. Um, so what was it about, in that context? What is it for you that's kind of unique about your approach and how it connects to like the broader academic conversation around these ideas?
That's a good question. Um, and look, I'm never trying to put down anybody else's work or approach. Let's get that clear. The Media Ecology Association is great. It's a great organization with a lot of potential and a lot of good people in it. And we've had a good relationship. My father and myself. Actually, my membership has lapsed. I keep getting notifications, so I have to renew my membership. But they gave me an award, 2 years ago, Jacques Ellul Award for
Mm,
media ecology activism for my work with the McLuhan Institute, which meant a lot more to me than I thought it would.
mm,
Honestly, I got a little choked up. It's funny. I wasn't going to stay for the awards banquet, and then my uncle Michael said, "Well, you kind of have to be there." And I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, they're giving you an award." I was like, "What? What the?" That didn't make sense to me, but it was really touching. Um, yeah, that's a good question. I think the main distinction between the work here and the work of academics is the institution. Maybe it's as simple as that. That I don't have. There are pros and cons. Working inside an institution is great for the access to um, materials and facilities and networks. But working here, I have, well, at this point, total autonomy. I basically do my own thing. I don't have to make sure I publish, this much, and I don't have to worry about tenure or anything like that. Uh, but mind you, I have my own worries. I
mhm,
still haven't figured out how to fund this thing really. At present, my sole funding outside my own pocket comes from a Patreon page, and that's great. That's helpful, but it's not enough to take this forward in a big way that I would like to. Um, yeah, so I really think the what separates my approach here from approaches elsewhere, with regards to McLuhan studies, if nothing else, is the focus on practicality. So I'm constantly trying to develop more of these tools. And I think of, maybe it's my craftsman bias, but I think about myself surrounded in this workshop by like a pegboard of tools, and I'm trying to put more on the pegs. And so identifying tools and then developing them and then making them accessible, and finding different ways to do that. So I share my work across Instagram and Facebook and Twitter,
Hmm.
and podcasts, and any other, basically any means necessary, really, to try and get things out there.
Yeah, we're in a unique situation now, right? Where you can create the McLuhan Institute in a relatively isolated, um, very much local place, and yet because of these new technologies, you and I can have this conversation. You can do other kinds of outreach. You can share what you're doing with potentially a sort of a limitless number of people. Just in terms of disseminating it out there.
Well, this
Uh,
has really been driven home for me, especially in the last year. The pandemic situation kind of forced a lot of people's hands,
yeah.
and forced us to turn potentials into, probabilities. So the potential for working from home, remote work, was put to the test, and I think quite successfully. We'll be dealing with the after effects of that for quite some time, because nothing is quite so permanent as a short term measure, right? But for example, the Understanding Media Intensive course that I gave, in starting in the fall, I was able to do through Gray Area in San Francisco, and from here, which, if I were to offer that course, which looked at the first 7 chapters of Understanding Media in detail, like great detail, if I were to just offer that in person locally, I would maybe have one person sign up. I don't know.
Mhm.
Instead, I was able to have a class of almost 40 people, from around the world, North America mainly, but also England, Indonesia, all over the place. And that was really great, and a little bit proof of concept for me with the McLuhan Institute. When I first started it, I had some people say to me, "Well, great, but you're going to have to be in Toronto or New York City." And I said, "Well, not really crazy about that idea. For one thing, all my physical resources are here in this area. But for another, I mean, it's kind of an if you build it, they will come thing. I
Mhm.
think if people are motivated enough, they'll actually come out here, and just, again, kind of the vibe. Um, I think because here I am situated literally in between farms. I've got a country road that, turns into a dirt road, or rather a more rough dirt road after being a roughish dirt road. And for people who want to come and, uh, read a book or look at some annotations, they can take a break and walk up the lane and think about it. And I think it's very, um, conducive to the kind of contemplation necessary to really get into this work. So I think, again, coming back to this idea of right place and time, I think this is the right place. And I think we're certainly in the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to get into that idea more of the the dichotomy between media studies, technology studies, media ecology, the types of things that you're kind of taking as your concern, and the environment in which you're kind of thinking these through, which is um, off the beaten path, not in the city, not kind of overwhelmed with enormous amounts of uh, technology. What do you think about that relationship between this sort of contemplative mode that you just referenced and the kind of highly saturated, highly digital, very fast paced, sort of full of distractions world of online media, social media, the way we communicate with each other, the potentials that we've just been discussing in terms of these conversations, remote work, all of those things have benefits, but they also leave us more plugged in more of the time. right? And
Y-
there's downsides there. So like what is
yeah.
what's the role of that kind of contemplative attitude in all of that?
There are increasingly fewer places, although that's kind of a contradiction. Uh, Safe places are becoming harder and harder to find in our world, in terms of, getting away from technology, and it's quickly becoming almost impossible. What Elon Musk is up to is uh, going to see that. In fact, his Starlink thing just went live in beta testing here in this area, and it is a matter of trade-offs, because without robust enough internet, I wouldn't be able to do this. I'm planning on having the second part of UMI next month, and that's made possible because of internet upgrades I was able to do here. And I've got this device and I've got this device, and I'm posting across, gosh, however many social media apps, and we live in the world we live in, and there's no real escaping it. So you have to do the best that you can. The advantage to being out here is that I have access to, if only the illusion of getting away from it all, right?
Mhm.
Walking up the lane, going outside. We've got a seasonal ice rink because the bottom of our field flooded, and we can skate on it. My kids can run around and things like that. At the same time, there's a debate, quote unquote, between Marshall McLuhan, Buckminster Fuller, and W.H. Auden. You can see this on YouTube. Listen to it, and they're debating television. And Auden says, Auden was a playwright, I believe. He says, "I don't have a television, and I wouldn't dream of having one." And Marshall replies, "Well, you simply pay the consequences without enjoying any of the benefits." You know, the thing is, we live in this world that we live in, and I think we have to find a balance between, um, if there is one to be found, between use and abuse. Not to
Mhm.
put it in too concrete terms, but
Mhm.
there's effects, there's fallouts, and the positive things we call benefits, and the negative things we call side effects or whatever. And I'm so often reminded of, you watch a commercial for a drug, and it shows a couple frolicking through a field in slow motion. Meanwhile, in the background, this guy is talking very quickly about all the bad things that are going to happen to you when you take this drug, aside from what it's supposed to do. And that to me feels like our technological condition. You know, Here we are concentrating on slow motion, running through the field and looking adoringly in our partner's eyes, while at the same time in the background all this stuff is happening to us. Our attention spans are shrinking to nothing. Our ability to sustain thought and attention and memory and all these things are all taking heavy tolls, especially in the last year. This is snowballing. And I think there's a pretty obvious cause and effect relationship there. But again, this is the world we live in, and what are our options? I think we have a couple of options. For one, because the effects of technologies occur on a few different levels. They occur on the personal level. So I am remade by my use of various things, from what we're doing to reading book. It's technologies, from speaking. Languages are technologies as much, verbal technologies as coding. Other languages are. So there's what that does to me, and then there's what this all does to our societies.
Mhm.
I can be somewhat responsible for myself and my family to an extent, and I have to trust, or leave it up to um, the governments, for example, to work on the bigger picture. And
Mhm.
they haven't been doing so great, frankly. Um, they can do a lot better. And one of my goals with McLuhan Institute is to be able to raise my voice enough and find the ears to talk to have meaningful conversations about regulation,
Hmm.
and not saying that we have to stop innovation, but to bring it back to drug companies, there was a time when drug companies were almost completely unregulated. And then the public made enough of a stink about it. People were dying, and they created the FDA, which said drugs have to be drugs and foods have to be safe and effective. Difficulty there with technology is that what safe and effective means is difficult to pin down,
Hmm.
because we don't understand the effects. It's not as obvious as sickness, as in taking a drug and all of a sudden your appendix bursts or whatever. That's pretty obvious. The technological effects are a lot more subtle, and combined with our apparent reluctance to recognize them for what they are, which
Right.
is another interesting thing. Um, but this isn't to say that we can't do anything about it, and I think we can. Again, to come back to the drug companies, you can imagine the drug companies were not thrilled at the idea of having to go through any testing, to put barriers between production, development, and production, right? Any company wants to get ahead of their competition and get their product on the shelf sooner. But we have a responsibility to our fellow human beings and our health. So the government's finally stepped in, created the FDA and similar organizations, and said, okay, you have to put your things through testing. You have to reduce the harm and make them safe and effective.
Hmm.
There's no reason we can't do this with technologies. Look, our technologies have um, effects. We can do things intentionally, rather than have them happen accidentally.
Hmm.
And uh, there's just no political will to do that, I
Right.
believe.
Right.
Um, so, but a problem is that no tech company, let's say Mr. Musk, does not want to have to deal with regulators and wants to beat his competition to get Starlink or whatever else it is to market ahead of his competition, and rightly so. That's the business environment. But we need to consider the effects. And what is the effect going to be of a couple thousand satellites blasting wireless at the entire globe?
Hmm.
I don't think anybody can answer that question. And that is a problem,
Yeah.
I think.
That's a theme that keeps coming up in so many different areas that we're running for better and worse, large scale experiments
Yeah.
with ourselves as the subjects.
Right? Like,
Large scale in the sense of population species level sized experiments under the assumption that, well, we can't see anything sort of devastating right around the corner that would result from us doing this, but we have no idea about the second order effects, the long term effects, um, what cascading causal reactions that can result from any of these moves. That um, yeah, honestly, it's a little bit scary to think about how you're just sort of at the whim, right? There's a lot of stuff that you can kind of control in your environment. You can do a tremendous amount in terms of your own decision making, how you want to set up your relationship to different technologies and things like that. But yeah, the satellites, Elon satellites, they're coming, and there's
oh,
going to
they're
be
out
internet
there.
everywhere. Yeah,
It-
and
It's
so
as
that's
hard. It's as hard to imagine. um, it's just so easy to imagine it going wrong.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and by the time we figure that out, it's too late.
right,
But as Marshall said, we can think things out before we put them out.
right.
And to bring that back, the whole focus of my McLuhan Institute is making these tools available for people to understand the effects of technologies. And I'm
Hmm.
not I'm not trying to say that we have all the answers,
Right.
but we have some answers. And Gosh, any place to start is a good place, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm certainly not, against the deployment of some of these technologies, but it's simply a fact that we don't know what they're going to do. And so doing them at scale like that seems foolish. On a long enough timeline, one of them certainly does go wrong, and then once it's gone wrong, we kind of just have to live with that. And I kind of,
Well, and this is where I think the ecology part of media ecology needs to
yeah,
come into play. And
yeah,
from my perspective, from our perspective, on the McLuhan side of things, ecology implies action.
hmm,
Not just study, but action. Doing something about it. If there's uh, a lot of pollution from the cement plant up the road, we study, we determine where the pollution's coming from, and we seek and apply solutions to mitigate that stuff. And not only is there no reason we can't do that with our communications or otherwise technologies, but I think there's certain existential reasons to be moving that way.
hmm, hmm. Yeah, and so I like the idea of the McLuhan Institute as kind of a sort of a listening post, almost an extra sensory organ that's kind of paying attention to what the other, technological devices and networks are actually doing to us. What do you think? Well, let's get back to media ecology real quick. We haven't really introduced that term. If we've referenced it a few times, but if somebody's just listening and hearing that word for the first time, can you give them a kind of just a quick intro on like what is media ecology and how does it play into the conversation we're having right now?
I'd be happy to. Media ecology is a field of study. Um, there are a few different schools, I think, of media ecology, or almost sub. There are media ecologies, let's say, and there's the McLuhan understanding on one side, um, and for example, there's a sort of a Neil Postman group, and then there might even be others. Um, I think a main distinction between the McLuhan and the Postman camps is that Postman said, and I'm not an expert on Postman, but he did say that he didn't see any point in studying technology without a moral point of view, essentially. And Marshall basically has said the opposite thing, that a moral point of view only gets in the way of evaluating the action of our technologies. So that's one distinction between the two. Media ecology, if you look on the website for the Media Ecology Association, mediaecology.org, I think they define it as the study of media as environments. And if you think of natural ecology and then apply it instead of the natural environment to our artificial environments created by technologies, you have a very good idea of what it's about.
Mhm.
Um, Marshall and my father Eric started using the term back in the 60s. And there's a little bit of contention. I'm not sure it really matters who said it first or whatever, but um, Marshall had definite ideas about what media ecology was. And I know this because of the time I've spent with his books, because Marshall was an annotator. For example, um, for people looking, I have a copy of ABC of Reading, Ezra Pound's book, which was a very important book for Marshall. And this was actually one of Marshall's copies of it, and it has a lot of his notes in the back.
Mm,
I have certain, so Marshall's method in reading was he would look out for key things, key concepts that he used in the work of other people to help him understand his own ideas. And when he found them, he would make a note of them in the margins and then on the end papers. So I've seen a fair amount of his annotations having to do with media ecology, and they're generally around this idea of natural ecology, that is, um, programming the environment for effects. He talked in Understanding Media about thermostatic controls for the environment of, um, when you've got one situation getting out of hand, turning down the amount of, as a very primitive understanding, but regulating use of technologies in order to see change in the human population. Basically, is the idea. I think in the early days it was kind of quaint. I think we're a lot more sophisticated now. I think the real name of the game, as far as media ecology goes, is on the front end, in the design stage of technologies. As Marshall said, thinking things out before we put them out. That's really where the smart money is, getting ahead of effects.
Hmm.
That's the only way we're really going to get anywhere, I think. So the McLuhan School of Media Ecology is all about um, designing and using technologies with an awareness of the personal and social consequences of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely does. Do you follow, recently there's been a lot of conversation around social media. There was a documentary, The Social Dilemma, that just recently came out, which, at least in spirit, is sort of similarly aligned to what you're talking about, just the realities of the algorithms, the realities of the user interface, how they kind of, hack into these, addictive behaviors that are sort of latent in human beings. They kind of charge up polarization, and they value certain kinds of content and communication over others. Is this is this sort of I think of that as a more kind of popular layer of a similar conversation. Is that do you follow those conversations, and do you have opinions about what they're seeing and what they're doing and how they're trying to intervene on the technologies?
Yeah, I follow it a little bit. I haven't seen that movie. I checked out the trailer or whatever when it came out, and honestly, I don't remember it well enough to comment on. But the impression I had, um, you know, this is where we get into different camps about media ecology, I think. And there's something else called media literacy.
Mm,
And to me, media literacy means something else. A lot of times, the conversation turns to content.
yeah.
For example, um, and I'm not down about content, but it's important to understand the content versus the form and the effects of both. For example, with this pandemic, my children had to stay home from school for a while. And our government here in Ontario, the Ontario Education Authority, said that um, my child, who just turned 7, was 6 years old in grade 1, should have 4 hours of synchronous online learning every day, 4 hours in front of a screen,
Hmm.
which is a little bit at odds with the Health Canada suggestion that they should have no more than 1 hour of screen time a day.
Hmm.
And in the Health Canada recommendation, they they put an emphasis on quality content, as if this makes much of a difference.
Yeah.
Um, this is where McLuhan studies comes in, because what Marshall found and revealed was that the quality of content is rather arbitrary and has very little to do with the effect of the medium of the technology. That as he said, it didn't matter whether the machine turned out Cadillacs or cornflakes. The effect of machine technology was the same.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter whether, I'm sure this is a quality podcast, but it doesn't matter whether we're having this conversation or whether two people down the road are talking about how their cows are milking. The effect of Zoom on our society, particularly in the last year, has operated in the aggregate and not on the nitty gritty level.
Hmm.
And that's why the medium is the message, the environment is the message. It's the sum total of the effects, which have uh, the really profound changes on
Hmm.
ourselves.
Hmm. Hmm. So, what are some of those? You've just given us a few of them, but what can you give us some more examples of tools, concepts, ways of thinking, or practices of relating that you find underrepresented or particularly helpful right now, like in terms of the always online Zoom, the social media, the encroaching reality of screens taking up more and more of our time? What should we be thinking about there that we aren't? Or is there a better way of connecting and, like you said, using the benefits of these things without, getting taken in by the downsides?
Yeah, this is the hard thing. I think the first thing to do is simply, and it's not simple, but pay attention. You
Mhm.
know, notice what's happening in your life, in yourself. Who are you today versus who you were a year ago or 2 years ago? Um, how are you different? And maybe examine why. What can we do about these things? Is the question, as far as I'm concerned. And I think there are things we can do. Um, for example, I've gotten into the habit of, I've really engaged more in poetry in the last year. I've written poetry since I was a kid. Really, the earliest things I can remember are writing poems. And I got away from it for a while. And I had a kind of early midlife crisis of existential thing about, am I still a poet? You know, and I decided if I ever was a poet, I am still a poet because poetry um, is a way of being, a way of seeing, as much
Mhm.
as it is writing a poem.
Mhm.
And I've experimented. So I've written a bit of poetry on my smartphone, and it was okay. It has some things to say for it, but for me, nothing beats a pen or a pencil on paper. And uh, it's not just a conceit on my part. Um, Nothing makes you sound quite so old as saying you prefer books over, movies. There's a funny joke that Marshall would tell. Um, a pair of goats are feasting on a pile behind a Hollywood studio, and the one is munching on a film print of, uh, Gone with the Wind, and the other goat says, "How are you liking that?" And the goat munches and says, "Well, I preferred the book." You know, so it's not just a matter of taste, but what technologies do for us and to us. And I recently challenged a class regarding poetry and methods to try composing 4 different ways. Try to compose a poem in your mind, just in your mind. Think it up. Don't write it down. Don't dictate it. See how far you can get. For me, I can get a couple of lines, maybe a few rhyming couplets or something like that. Very difficult for us to do. But a few short thousand years ago, this was the way it was done. Not just a few lines, but thousands of lines.
Mhm.
Um, it, oral transmission was the main method of transmitting all our cultural knowledge, and it was the poets who did that. Now we're lucky if we can try it yourself and see at the end of the day if you can remember 4 lines. Good luck.
Mhm.
Now try writing a poem with pen, pencil, and paper. Find, observe that experience, see what you can do. Try dictating a poem into your smartphone, and then try typing one on your computer or your smartphone, or maybe one of each. Depends how deep you want to go with the experiment. And you'll notice differences in quality. The reason I prefer pen or pencil, and actually I usually go with pen on paper, is so I can type around 80 words a minute, and it's a great way to hammer out copy. I can't write 80 words a minute.
Mm.
Slowing my hand down slows my mind down. Okay. And when your mind is racing and you want to slow it down, write. Doesn't matter what you write about. This comes back to the idea of content, but uh, the point is the process and what that's doing to you. So high on anxiety, getting really anxious, can't slow down your thoughts. Staring into space isn't necessarily going to help you. Writing might. Writing forces your mind to slow down, and that can be helpful. Another thing, and I realized this a little late, but I figured it out eventually with my son. The mandate was for this 4 hours of synchronous learning, but it didn't explicitly say you had to have the camera on, right? So what I did was I turned the camera off and I turned the brightness down so that the screen was blank.
Hmm.
Um, he could still hear and participate in everything, but it wasn't, glued to the screen. And I think that's, it gets, for myself, it gets tiring really quickly.
Hmm.
So, take breaks. Let your eyes, give your eyes a break and let your eyes breathe to an extent. There are things like this that I think we can do that can provide relief.
Hmm.
And they're not costly or high tech, even, or complicated things. But I think they can go a long way. I've noticed I'll sit down a few times a week, a couple times a week in the morning and write a poem. Um, and it's had a really positive, I feel, effect on me. And it's improved the quality of my writing as well.
Hmm.
So to the point that I'm just publishing this book of poems that you mentioned at the beginning. It's coming out March 23rd, and the link, the pre-order button just went live this afternoon. So you can find it at Revelor Press. Written matter by Andrew McLuhan.
Nice. Yeah, I'll
Please
include
feel
I'll
free.
include the link in the notes. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was my question because I kind of lost what you said right before we hit record.
Oh,
So the book is coming out on March 23rd, but the pre-order is available today, which
yeah.
will this will come up in post in about a week or two. So it'll definitely be there
To
when
to give
folks.
maybe another poetry tip,
Yeah.
um, because poetry can be intimidating for people.
Hmm.
I mean, look, take the pressure off yourself. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be aiming for a Pulitzer here. The humbling and good thing about the relative value of and the subjectiveness of quality, what's good, what's not, is you can receive the benefit regardless of how great your poetry is, right? You
Hmm.
don't have to share it.
Hmm.
I love sharing, and I'm a performative kind of person, so that's good for me. But one thing I started doing, because this iPhone I carry around is a really great camera, um, just in my small property, I've been when I'm on my way out. So the house is over there, and it's like 50 feet away to this building. And on the way, I take some pictures, and I use this as my starting point. It's difficult to confront a blank page. Where do you start? But once you start, the hardest thing is the first step. Once you get going, momentum counts for a lot. You can work off what you've done. So I got into the habit of starting with a photo, and I'm not necessarily illustrating the photo with my words. Sometimes it's influencing me more than other times, sometimes not at all. But it's helpful as a starting point. So
Hmm.
that's an idea for people to consider.
Right. It sounds to me like you're describing pretty clearly what are to me meditative exercises, contemplative exercises, things
Sure.
that you would find, explicitly described in spiritual religious texts, the exercises of the spirit, the spirituality and religion. Is that is that something that you carry around with you consciously? Do you have sort of meditative and contemplative resources in that sense, sort of in your background growing up, or are these kind of exercises that you just kind of developed in conjunction with the work you're doing?
I think the answer is probably a bit of all of that. I certainly grew up in a Catholic tradition, although it's not something I've followed closely since I was a kid. But of course, it's there. How explicitly I consider these things, um, I mean, they're always in the back of my mind, and prayer is maybe a loaded word, but I talk to certainly my father and my grandfather all the time and
Hmm.
ask for their guidance and presence and help. I mean, look, I can't help it. I'm surrounded here. So
Yeah.
their presence is really inescapable, and I'm glad for it. But I certainly find that quite helpful. After my dad died, um, I I was scared because when this happens, I think it's common reaction for people that you think about all the things you want to ask, and they're no longer there.
Hmm.
Gosh, I have so many questions, and why didn't I think of them at the time? But now it's too late. And my advantage that I'm so very grateful for is that, and I realized this eventually, that my dad might not be alive anymore, but he and Marshall are still so present here in this library, not just in spirit, but in reality. Like this book is
Hmm.
full of, I've almost come to see that ink is almost like, not to get again too out there on it, but kind of like blood. There's something essential about it. It's more than just words and markings. It's like there's a little piece of them there, and
Hmm.
that's a factor. Um, and all these annotations, all these notes my dad left around here are all answers to the questions, any question I might have. I just have to look for it. And that, wow, how comforting that was,
Hmm.
personally, but also um, for the McLuhan Institute, because as I said, one of the things I'm really big on doing is sharing and making things accessible. So not only are the answers to my questions here and at the Fisher Rare Book Library in Toronto, but the answer to all sorts of people's questions are here waiting to be discovered. So I think that's a wonderful thing, and it's something to be, again, uh, mindful of when considering how you interact with your technologies and what you're going to leave behind for people.
Hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. Maybe we can close out here with just some final thoughts on, you just published this book, or soon to be published. You've got the Institute up and running. What would you like to see happen in the next year or two, 5 years? Um, how can the rest of us get involved? How can we help you? I'm falling in love with the mission, listening to you talk about it, and just very much wanting um, all of these all of these other types of institutions. I feel like it's a time of like renewal for different kinds of institutions that can really meet the challenge of this really fastly changing and chaotic time that we live in. And so, what would you like to see happen in the next few years with this project?
Wow. I mean, the daunting thing about the McLuhan Institute is I feel like there's so much left to do. So much has been left to me. And I have two sons, two kids. I don't want to have to leave it to them. So I'm trying to do as much as I can. But the problem is that, and it's problem is a relative term, but I think of Marshall. Marshall considered himself an explorer. He said, "I don't explain, I explore." And he's the kind of person who I think of him like somebody who discovers icebergs. When you see an iceberg, you're only seeing the top 10% of it, right?
Hmm.
The rest of it is down under there. And I feel like Marshall was this guy who went around saying, "Oh, look, here's an iceberg, and oh, look, there's an iceberg, and here's an iceberg," and he left so much work left for us to do. He
Hmm.
just kind of opened the way, opened a lot of doors. My father went in and described a lot of the rooms behind those doors. but he didn't do everything. He had his strengths, which were like scholarly activities. He retaught himself Greek to be able to do the deep work on formal cause for his book Media and Formal Cause. That was the kind of deep, heavy scholarship he was into, and is really inspiring to me. He led so much by example, and he set the bar very high. I hope I can live up to it. What I hope to have happen, you know, 2 years from now, I hope to have this door open and being able to welcome you or anybody else here. I hope to have the suite open upstairs so that people can come and visit and really engage and get their hands dirty, metaphorically speaking, in the library here. I hope to be publishing a lot more things. Look, I'm really glad that my first major publishing project is my book, but I've got other things that are screaming out to be published. One example of that is I've got I've got so many treasures in here, but one of them is a folder, a file box full of Marshall's speech notes.
Mhm.
So when Marshall would give a speech, he didn't generally type it out and read it. He would make pages of point form notes that he would speak from. And I've got folder and folder and folder and folder of speech notes from various different addresses, including the 1969 speech he gave to the Bilderberg Conference. I would love to publish that. That's an example of the publishing projects ahead of me.
Mhm.
So I suppose I get enough attention and funding to be able to open this place up as much as I hope to. Um, and some of that comes down to, if you believe in this kind of work, support it. I know you have a Patreon for your side view project, and the McLuhan Institute has a Patreon page, which unfortunately I don't spend probably enough attention to. Sorry, people, I love you. But the great thing about the age that we live in is that you can make a difference with $10 a month.
Mhm.
If you're one person in the crowd, it's easy to make a big difference in somebody else's life. If that's an artist who isn't able to gig these days, support them. Or if it's an institution like mine, which I am the McLuhan Institute. Honestly, I have this great
Yeah.
assistant, Stephen Paler, who does a lot of things for me. The podcast is due to him, but essentially, it's a one person show. So before I'm able to get institutional funding, I'm relying on the generosity of people who believe in Marshall McLuhan's work and my efforts to bring it forward. So support each other, and hopefully, we'll make everybody's dreams come true.
Yeah, that's a great place to close. Why don't you just tell people really quickly, what is the Patreon? What is, if they want to follow you on Twitter, other social media accounts, just the places they can find you.
I mean, probably the easiest thing is just go to the McLuhaninstitute.com. There should be links to all that on there. Shout out to my brother-in-law, Scott Bohms, for getting that website up. You know what? I'm really so blessed to be surrounded by and attracting so many people want to help me and do help me, and I couldn't do this, on my own, no question. So I appreciate that. Other than that, if you search the McLuhan Institute on Twitter, I throw out Twitter's great for McLuhan because McLuhan was so aphoristic,
Hmm.
and it's easy to find a little bite. He said the future of the book is the blurb, and it's almost like he wrote in tweets.
Yeah.
So I put a couple up every day, and it's not stuff that you'll come across casually. I try to pick out interesting things that you might not find elsewhere. Instagram, I tell the story of the McLuhan Institute in images, basically. On the Facebook page, I do a live broadcast it's Tuesday tonight at 9 p.m. Every
Nice.
Tuesday night, basically at 9, I do a 15 to whatever live thing about whatever I've got going on here in the office. And what else? That's the majors right now.
Nice. Well, I want to wish you the best of luck on the Institute, and I hope to see it grow and flourish over the next few years. And I hope we can do this again soon. Maybe we can check in, see how things are going. Maybe next year things have um, changed again, maybe return to normalcy somewhat, and we can do a check in about what's happening with you and what's going on.
Well, I think the one thing we can count on is that things are going to be a lot different a year from now than they are today.
Yeah.
And thank you, Adam. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Take care of yourself.
Yeah. Likewise. Take care.